tonight, today, so I'm excited about that. I have come to love speaking almost as much as leading worship sometimes. And so since I was here last, we have a few new developments in my family. Just in the last, it's either 5 or 6 weeks now, I've lost count, my family moved. And we moved from Buffalo, New York, where we have been the last 10 years. We moved down to Nashville, Tennessee. So a little bit south, a little bit warmer, a little bit out of the Buffalo snow globe, and down to just outside of Nashville, Music City, where there's a lot of music, a lot of Christian music being written and stuff. And I really wanted, hopefully, do more writing, and it just feels like it makes sense. We felt the Lord leading us there, and so we moved there. But we will still be up here in Canada all the time, as I am. I'm going to be driving back probably today. I was on the fence whether I was going to sleep at my parents in Brantford tonight or drive back today. I might be driving back today. So it'll be, we'll be back and forth a lot. My wife and I are still involved in the Better Us show, and we will continue still to be. If you're not familiar, it's a marriage television show that airs on Thursday nights on Yes TV, and it's around, I think it's 9:30. Is that right? Does anyone know offhand that watches it? That it airs at night on Yes TV and a few other networks, and it's also available on YouTube. So it's for married couples, just gives you marriage encouragement in a half-hour TV show format. A big chunk of it is us couples. I say us because my wife and I join in every other week or so, talking about marriage stuff, just from a real perspective, and hopefully to be an encouragement. So yeah, we're still doing stuff like that. We'll drive up and we're doing some more taping. We're actually working on season 7 of that coming up soon. So that's all good, and so we won't lose touch. We'll be still around and back up for Brayside and camp and all that as we just were. I have a couple things. I hate commercial stuff, but it'd be silly for the Lord to give us gifts and to encourage the body, and then to us not present them to the body and let you at least know about them to decide for yourself if you want to avail yourself of them. My wife, who's not here this weekend with me, is an author. And she's written 5 books, and 3 of those 5, here's one of them, are from a Table Talk series, it's called. And what they are is family devotions for families with young kids, if that's you, or if you know someone who is, or you have grandkids or whatever. And they're short little devotions that are really easy to do. They're a lot of fun to do because each devotion starts off with a real life kids quote, some of the things that our kids, crazy things that our kids have said over the years, or other kids as well. And she takes whatever that crazy thing is, which hooks the kids in and gets them interested, and then turns it into a little nugget of Bible teaching, basically hands you on a silver platter a great way to have a biblical conversation with your kids and teach them about the Bible, because how many know if we don't teach them, they're not going to learn? Like, it's our job as their parents, as their grandparents, as their aunts or uncles or whatever, to instill the Word of God in our kids, because they're certainly not getting it at school, and we can't just leave it to the Sunday school teacher. That's yours and my job. I keep jumping over this little step here. And then lastly, my wife has written 2 other books for the ladies. Ladies, give me a woohoo! There you are. All right. This is for you. There's a book here called Why Can't We All Just Get Along? And then the Get Along Guide is a companion Bible study. You can do them separately, but they work really well together. And it deals with a lot of the things that we all deal with as humans. Guys, we deal with these things too. Things like insecurity, comparison, comparing ourselves one to another, competition, jealousy, envy, gossip. All of these things that we all as humans do. But ladies, you have kind of a unique way of doing them. A little bit different than us guys. And you might not, have your claws out, kind of like the first housewives of Highway Church or something like that, right? But we have their little things that lay, they're kind of under the surface, little heart issues where we struggle with insecurities or comparing ourselves to each other. And my wife tackles these things head on. These are both excellent. So they're there, and I'll just letting you know about them. And then lastly, this is called a CD. If you're not familiar with what a CD is, if you're young enough, it's like a coaster. It's round, and you can put your coffee mug on it, and it protects your table underneath. No. So truth be told, we're almost out of CDs because they are a little bit older. But some people still have CD players in their car or whatever. And there was actually so many Christian bookstores are closing these days that there was a Christian bookstore in Buffalo that closed. And they're like, we have these CDs still. And I'm like, well, sure, I'll bring them. So we have some CDs available of some worship music that I've written. All right, there we got that all out of the way. Good. Okay. So when Pastor Rob told me, all right, so we are in a series, and as it goes, you're going to land in Daniel chapter 6. Is that all right with you? And I was like, yeah, that's all right with me. Absolutely. I love Daniel. Daniel and I share the same name. Right? So I go by Dan these days, but my real name is actually Daniel. And so I've always somewhat identified with Daniel a little bit. Usually, now when I grew up, when I was younger, everyone called me Danny. So now when I'm out and about, if I'm in Canada or something, and I'm with my wife maybe, and we meet somebody who calls me, oh hey Danny, she knows, oh, this is someone from Brantford. Like if she doesn't know the name. This is someone from Brantford that knew, Dan's church when he grew up or something, that knew him as Danny and still calls him Danny. But when I hit puberty, it was like, it's Dan. I graduated to Dan. And then, although 1984, Karate Kid came out. And Daniel LaRusso, I thought he was so cool. And I always thought, oh man, I should have gone by Daniel. That's a way better name than Danny or Dan. I was like, I should really have actually gone by Dan. And I've always figured if I ever moved somewhere and had a chance to start over and introduce myself anew, I would say, oh, my name's Daniel, because that's a better name. And I still actually, one of my bosses from Connecticut, my senior pastor who was my boss there when I was a pastor there, he still calls me Daniel-san. So still calls me that. So anyways, I identify with Daniel. And then actually, to top it all off, I married a Danielle. So I'm Daniel and I married a Danielle. So in my household, we identify with Daniel. And you know what? Do you know what the name Daniel means? It means God is my judge. And you've been already learning about Daniel a little bit if you've been in church the last few weeks, but this is the week, this is the chapter where we really see his name flesh out, and we really see God is my judge play out in Daniel's life. And at first, I gotta tell you, when I was a kid and I found out my name meant God is my judge, that felt heavy. That was scary. Oh my goodness, God's my judge. I don't want to be judged. And then we're going to learn in this story, and we're going to figure out, and I've figured out in life, that it is way better to have God as your judge than any other person. It's an acknowledgement that, you know what? You say what you want about me, think what you want about me, but God is my judge. And there's a sense of fear. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and knowledge. It's a sense of fear and reverence and respect in knowing that God is my judge. That's my name. It's true of all of us, though. So this is where Daniel is. The name Daniel comes from God is my judge, meaning that that God is the one who judges him. Just like Paul said, for am I now seeking the approval of man or of God, or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. Paul says that in Galatians chapter 1, verse 6. So Daniel is approaching it the same way. Now, many of us are super familiar with the story of Daniel in the lion's den, and the temptation would be to turn our ears off this morning and be like, yeah, I know. Survives the den, I get it, yeah, whatever, I've been here, done that. So I want to encourage you to tune in here, because there's going to be something, there's going to be some fresh stuff, hopefully, in here for you in the midst of that. Most of us grew up, I did not bring my felt board with my felt lions and felt Daniel. Only those of us of a certain age would know what the heck I'm even talking about, felt board. But that's the way we grew up in Sunday school. There'd be a felt board, and there would be little sticky lions that would stick on, and sticky Daniel, and then all the different things. Didn't do any of that. But we're going to look at the story of Daniel. Now, when you left off last week, yes, chapter 5, when you left off in Daniel, Belshazzar and the kingdom of Babylon, which had conquered Judah and then taken Daniel and the Israelites captive almost 70 years before, had just been overthrown, literally overnight. That's what happened. The last story we read was that the hand appears on the wall and writes many, many tekel parsin, and the king doesn't know what it means. Daniel comes in and tells him what it means. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and so the kingdom's going to be taken from you. And literally that very night, probably while this banquet was going on, the Persians had, I believe the way it goes historically, is they had stopped up the river up the way, and there was a river that went into the city, and when they stopped up the river, it allowed some space for them to get through underneath where the river had been. And anyways, at any rate, the Persians take over the Babylonian army, the Babylonian kingdom. And so when we start chapter 6, we find King Darius, or Darius. I'm not sure which is the correct pronunciation. I've heard both, and I might switch between both because I've been hearing both a lot lately. But King Darius, or Darius, however you want to say his name, is the one in charge. Now, historically, you're going to find that some people have actually doubted the story of Daniel because they can't reconcile who Darius or Darius is, and so there's some confusion or different opinions, let's say, about who Darius is. Some might say that he's kind of like it was actually Cyrus the Persian, Cyrus the Great, who Isaiah prophesied about, like I think 150 years earlier. Before Cyrus was even born, Isaiah, if you read in Isaiah, it says that Cyrus is going to come and he is going to then vanquish the Babylonian army. This is way before any of this had ever happened. So Cyrus the Persian, Cyrus the Great, was the one really in charge, and Darius was probably a subsidiary or an appointed king of that region at that time. That's probably the most likely thing of what went on here. So, but no matter what, Darius or Darius was the one in charge. He was the new king, and he was 62. So in today's chapter, let's start at Daniel 6, chapter 1. And we'll start right there. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of them whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now, Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So here we have the new king, Darius. It's like, I'm going to set up this administrative structure to keep all the affairs in order. And what there's going to be is there are going to be 120, let's call them like senators. And then those 120 senators, 40 of them are each going to report to these 3, let's call them like governors. And Daniel was one of those 3. So each responsible for about 40 people who are responding to them, and then they're in charge. And then Daniel does such a good job at being over those 40 that the king's watching him, and he's going, you know what? I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make Daniel the 1 over the 3. So maybe I graduate one of the 40 up to the 3, and Daniel's going to be like the prime minister. Daniel's going to be the prime minister under me, and then there's going to be the 3, and then there's going to be the 120. Daniel did so well that the king was preparing to set Daniel over them as prime minister. You know, the Bible says in Proverbs 18:16 that your gift will make a way for you. That Daniel, through his diligence and through the gifting of God that was on his life, and we're going to see why that was on his life shortly, and you already have as you've been reading Daniel, set him up for this success. But at the same time, that success proved a problem, as it often does. Because this is where the trouble began for Daniel, picking up at verse 4. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of governmental affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Interesting here, they're looking at Daniel, they don't want him to be over them. I suspect that probably because they know that Daniel is pure, Daniel does things by the book, Daniel does things right, and if he is suddenly over them, he's going to be watching them, and he's going to catch that they are not doing things right. The text suggests that Christians who want to live holy lives should expect persecution. It also explains why. Because godliness posed a threat to those who would use their positions corruptly to benefit at the expense of others. They were jealous of Daniel, kind of like we were just talking about with Danielle's books there. They were jealous of Daniel. Why? The Bible says the darkness hates the light. The darkness hates the light. John chapter 3:19 says, "This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come into the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, so that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God." They didn't like Daniel because, you know what? No one likes the goody two-shoes, right? I mean, that's just life. Like, no one makes you look worse at work when you come in late all the time than the one who's always there bright and early with a coffee for the boss, right? It makes you look bad. It shines a light on you. It shows your lack. It shows your lack. And that is what happens with why the darkness hates the light. When we live our lives as unto God, when we live our lives serving Him, doing our best, and God's favor rests on us, and God blesses us and increases our tent and blesses the work of our hands as His word promises to do, guess what? It not only catches the attention of God, it will catch the attention of those around you who don't like you or don't want you to succeed or are insecure about their own faults or are just plain crooked in their own ways. They won't like you. So when the Bible says that Daniel was honest and trustworthy and not corrupt, it's also actually kind of implying that these guys were. So there was jealousy in this story of evil men. But you know what? I heard it recently said, if they have skin on, they're not your enemy. If they have skin on, they're not your enemy. So I would suggest to us, in our temptation, to want to look at those around us that might not like us for our serving of God, it's not really them. It's not really about them. If they, the Bible says we don't wrestle with flesh and blood. Our wrestle is not with those people. We trust God to look after them. And we recognize and realize that really it's the enemy that's behind the sinful hearts of man that doesn't like you, that doesn't like you serving God, that doesn't like God blessing you, that doesn't like you raising your family in godly ways and setting a godly example. He doesn't like all of those things. And it's really the enemy that's targeting you. If they have skin on, they're not actually the ones that are your enemy. But anyways, they go after Daniel. They got a magnifying glass out. They're looking for some way they can trip him up to stop this promotion from him being over them. And they can't find anything. They can't find any weakness in Daniel. So here's what they do. They find a weakness in the king. They can't find any weakness in Daniel, so they find a weakness in the king, his pride. And this becomes their in. Here's what they do, verse 5. Finally, these men say, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel, unless it's something to do with the law of his God." So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king, minus Daniel, and they say, "May King Darius live forever." The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any other god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your royal majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Did you notice the lie in there? They came to them as a group and they said, we've all agreed. Well, Daniel wasn't in on this. One of the king's main men, the one he was thinking of appointing over them all, they're lying to him. They're saying, we've all agreed on this, king. But they're leaving out Daniel, who did not agree on this. It strikes me here that these people, the cynicism of these people, they were totally godless. Clearly, they had no fear of the Lord. They had nothing within them restraining them that said, listen, we don't want to mess around with who we pray to, because it meant nothing to them. They obviously didn't pray, at least not in a way that mattered, because they didn't mind praying to this king. The prayer part was of no special value to them, but they used it as a weapon against Daniel. Here's what Daniel does. Verse 10. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the window opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Daniel had a pattern in his life of praying, of going up into his room, opening the window that faced towards Jerusalem. Remember, Daniel was in exile from Jerusalem. That was where he was as a young boy, probably in his teens, when he was taken as a captive into this Babylonian empire and kingdom that he had been serving and living in. But Daniel would have set this precedent in his life, and everybody knew it, because he prayed in his window 3 times a day, every day. Everybody knew that that's what Daniel did. They saw him do it all the time. David was basically following not a law. There was no law in God's law that had to do that. He was kind of following basically a precedent that David had set in Psalms chapter 55, where David says, morning, noon, and night I seek you. And so Daniel had decided to make that a pattern in his life, and this was the source of his strength. His consistent serving and seeking of God. And so Daniel went home and kept doing it. He went home and prayed anyways, not because someone told him to, but because it was part of his character. It was a spiritual habit that he had created in his life 3 times a day. He prayed day in and day out, even when it was hard. It's who he was. Consistently, Daniel said yes to God and no to the crowd. Daniel built his faith muscles daily and consistently, so that when the crisis came, it found him already with a strong faith, not needing to figure out how to pray cold in that moment. No, he was a praying man already. He didn't just pray in a crisis, he prayed in the calm. And so because of that, he knew how to also pray in a crisis. Right? This was something he built in his life day in and day out. Too many of us, I think we only pray maybe when we're in trouble. I don't say that with any judgment, because I say that looking at myself. And I've recognized in my own life that sometimes that, man, when something's going wrong, that I am out, walking and praying and praying and praying, and I'm drawn to praying that much more. And then sometimes when life is good and life is chill, I forget. I might, start doing other things, and I don't do it at least the same way that I always did. And my prayer often in my life has been to the Lord, teach me how to seek you and love you in the good times as well as the bad. Not just when I need you, not when I need a rescue, not when I need a financial miracle or a health miracle or whatever, not just in the hard times, but I love the consistency of Daniel. The reason that Daniel was able to live his life blameless and faultless, that his enemies with a magnifying glass couldn't find any dirt on this guy, no skeletons in the closet. The thing that steadied him in that mix was that prayer, that 3 times a day prayer that was unswerving. This gives us a window into Daniel's source of strength and everything else notable about him. His ability that we've been seeing already in the scriptures to understand and interpret visions. His favor, his own visions and dreams and prophetic writings that we're going to continue reading as we read through Daniel. They all stem from this consistent commitment to honor and seek God every day. And then, faced with this new law, Daniel read the law, he knew exactly what it was, and he knew what was coming his way, but he prayed anyways. Daniel knew that by going down and opening up his window as he always had, not in some show. It's not like he used to pray in his prayer closet, and now he's like smugly, well, yeah, don't pray, well, I'll show you, and open his window and pray in front of everyone. No, he did what he always did, but he knew opening his window and kneeling down to pray, he was going to get a chance to pet some kitty cats. He knew what was coming his way. But here's the thing. The issue was a matter of law and public policy and practice. Thus, its violation must be public. This was not the first day that anyone had seen Daniel praying in the window. This is where they got the idea from. This is how they knew they were going to be able to catch him. See, so at this moment, private disobedience to the law would have been hypocritical. And it would have hindered Daniel's testimony. His opponents expected Daniel to disobey the law publicly. You get what I'm saying? It's like it was a showdown. The law was made specifically to showcase whether Daniel was going to pray or not pray. So Daniel to say, okay, well, I'm just going to pray quietly as I walk about the kingdom now, and I'm going to, not pray in the window, then he would be clearly backing down from his convictions, because it was made to showcase, are you going to do it or aren't you going to do it? Do you believe what you're saying or don't you? Can you be intimidated? That's something right there. Can this guy be intimidated into backing down? See, someone could have come to Daniel and made the argument, listen, don't do it. Don't go pray in the window. Listen, it's a dumb rule. It's for 30 days. Here, listen, you are being put in a position of power, Daniel. They're about to make you the prime minister over the whole region. And if you just pray quietly, just pray quietly to yourself. They don't even have to know that in your head you're praying. Just pray quietly for these 30 days, and then you can preserve this position that God's placing you in for the greater good. And think about it. If you get thrown into the lion's den, Daniel, then these guys that are out to try and kill you, these evil guys, these crooked, godless guys, they're going to be the ones put in power. So for the sake of the kingdom, for the greater good, why don't you just hide it? Like, just pretend, or just don't do it publicly. But Daniel knows that the line's been drawn in the sand, and they're watching to see, does he believe what he says he believes? And so he chooses civil disobedience. I wonder how many of us, if there was a law passed in Canada that we could not pray for the rest of the month of August, how many of us would pray? God, I hope we don't ever find out. But it's an interesting question to ask ourselves. What would I do? What would I have done if I was Daniel? Would I follow that reasoning of the friend that I just suggested? I don't know. The other thing I want us to know where Daniel's strength comes from in that verse, those verses that we just read, is one other thing before we move on. The idea that he opens his window facing Jerusalem. There's something key here in this. He faces Jerusalem towards Jerusalem. Listen, Daniel's in captivity, but with an eye towards home. He's in a culture that is completely contrary to his own Jewish culture, and he knows it. Trapped in Babylon, his whole life, he reminded himself of his real home and of a culture that he lived out despite what's going on around him. See, the temptation for all the Jews would just be to assimilate into the Babylonian culture and just be like everyone else around them. That's the same temptation that there is for you and me, to just forget about the kingdom of which is our real home, the kingdom not of this world, and assimilate, just be like everybody else and assimilate into the culture. But every day, 3 times a day, Daniel kneels facing Jerusalem, and he's reminding himself of where he came. Remember that, that phrase, don't forget where you come from? Right? Don't forget where your real home is. And he's reminding himself that I might live in this culture, I might live in this pagan culture, but I am not of this culture. I am of a different culture. I am of a higher kingdom. I am of a greater kingdom. And my allegiance ultimately is to that kingdom. And he reminds himself of that. And not only that, but if he had been reading the scriptures, which I know and I'm sure he was, and you're going to find out in a couple chapters, a Revelation, where Daniel is reading the scriptures and opens up Jeremiah and realizes that, oh my goodness, Jeremiah prophesied that the Babylonians were going to take us captive, yes, but he says it's going to be for 70 years. And then they start looking at the calendar and they realize this is almost over. We're almost at the end of this, and they start making preparations for this. The Babylonians coming and taking over was the start of Cyrus, which is going to send the Israelites back, or allow some of them to go back and begin to rebuild Jerusalem. Daniel is waiting with an expectancy, trusting God for that day that he hasn't seen yet, but he's trusting is coming. You and I live our lives and pray with an expectancy that God, come build your kingdom here. Come build your kingdom through me here. Come plant the seeds of your kingdom through me here. And your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. My allegiance is to your kingdom. And Lord, I want to see your kingdom come here. This is all wrapped up in Daniel facing Jerusalem. Daniel realized that he is a dual citizen. And you and I are dual citizens as well. And I think that allegiance and that tenacious holding on to something other than the world that's around them, that was part of what irked the others as well. Because here's Daniel facing Jerusalem. He, in a couple of minutes, in a verse or two, these enemies are going to refer kind of like a negatively to Daniel as one of those Judean exiles, basically. One of those dirty Jew exiles, like a foreigner, not one of us. And part of what I think irked them is this Daniel. He's holding on to this Jerusalem thing. He's holding on to this God thing rather than embracing what we're all embracing and living life the way we are living. Again, the otherness, the set apartness that Daniel is living his life out draws negative attention, and it will for us too. Jesus said, don't be surprised if they hate you because of me. When you and I live according to the culture and the lifestyle of a kingdom that's other than the one that's around us, it will draw negative attention and people will hate us because the darkness hates the light. And I don't say that haughtily like we're the light and you're the dark. That's not the spirit with which we do it, but it's true. The Bible says it's true, and Jesus said it would be true. And I would ask us, maybe if we're not drawing any haters, are we actually being very light? It's worth considering. Okay, let's go back to the story. Verse 11. So, these men went as a group, and they found Daniel praying and asking for God's help, like he always did. So they went to the king, and they spoke to him about the royal decree. Hey, did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any other god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? I seem to remember you signing something about that this morning, I think, wasn't it? And the king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of those exiles from Judah," there it is, one of those guys, "he pays no attention to you, king, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed, and he was determined to rescue Daniel and he made every effort until sundown to save him. The king liked Daniel, right? These guys are walking around like VeggieTales singing, "Oh no, what we gonna do? The king likes Daniel more than me and you." Any other VeggieTales people? Did anyone else remember that at all? Okay. And Daniel's like, well, the king likes Daniel. Like, Daniel's a good guy. He's doing a great job. In fact, so much so that he's going to give him a promotion. And the king realizes right now, oh my goodness, I've been tricked. And he likes Daniel. And so what he sets about the rest of the day, because the law of the Medes and Persians said that execution would happen by the night. So my guess is Daniel prayed in the morning. They were waiting for it. Or maybe it was they signed the law in the morning. They were waiting at noontime, and they caught him praying at noontime. They go to the king, and he's got basically the rest of the day to try and figure out some way. He's calling all the lawyers in. All right, is there some kind of way we can change this to save Daniel? And he can't figure it out, and he can't figure it out. He can't save him. And then they twist what Daniel did. See, the decree was designed to misrepresent Daniel's devotion to God as contempt for the government. It was making something that wasn't look like it was. It was designed to make the fact that Daniel was loyal to his God, and was designed to make that look like he was disloyal to the government. But Daniel wasn't. At every interaction with the king here, he's the king's friend. He's completely respectful to the king. He respects his position of authority, even when the laws are not in his favor, but he can't obey the law. He was respectful to the king, but he couldn't obey the law. And then the men, in verse 15, they went to the group, they went as a group to King Darius and said to him, "Remember, your majesty, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." See, they saw him trying to work and figure out a way to save Daniel, and that's why they tricked him into doing the law in a way that could not be changed. And here we have the enemy, I feel like, overplaying their hand a little bit. Because they're revealing their heart so much. They're going and they're basically rubbing the king's nose in it. King, you can't get out of this one. You signed that law, and now David has to die. Sorry. The enemy will always overplay his hand, and it's going to come back to bite them, as we're going to see in a minute. Verse 16. So the king gave the order. He had no choice. And they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said, "Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." What a cool testimony by the king. A pagan king's observation of Daniel was that Daniel served his God continually. If we set an example of faithfulness, you never know who will be impacted. It was clear here that Daniel, living out his faith in God, impacted those around him positively, especially the king himself. When Daniel was put in the den, before leaving, King Darius said again, "May your God, who you serve continually, deliver you." So King Darius was touched not only by Daniel's devotion of faith to God, but also his devotion to the king in accepting his punishment, as unfair as it was. The testimony of Daniel's boss that he served the Lord continually proves that you don't have to be a pastor or in full-time ministry, or serving in some Christian nonprofit or something, to serve the Lord continually. That serving the Lord continually is not for, Pastor Rob and Pastor Scott and other people who do ministry all day. It's not, no. Daniel had a government position, a very busy one, as one of the heads of the country, about to be made only second to the king. He had very busy duties. He had, 40 people, about to be 123 people reporting to him. He had lots of responsibilities. He was a busy guy, and yet his reputation was he served the Lord continually. You and I, no matter what's going on in our lives, no matter how busy we are, we're not off the hook here. We can, by the way we live our lives, our testimony can be they served the Lord continually. And Daniel's life had such a great impact on the king that the king says, your God can deliver you. I've done everything I can. Daniel, I tried all day. I talked to every lawyer, and you know how I don't like talking to the lawyers, but I talked to the lawyers all day, and I can't do it. But I know that your God can deliver you. What a great testimony out of someone who doesn't even yet necessarily believe God fully yet, and yet here he does. Continuing, verse 17. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of the nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Daniel was put into the lion's den. You know what? Daniel's faithfulness to God got him in the lion's den. Think about that for a second. Daniel's faithfulness to God got him in the lion's den. He did the right thing, and his reward was he was going to be eaten alive. There's a false idea that if you're saved and you serve God, that you will not have any problems or difficulties in life. It's just not true. You will have difficulties, but the God who saved you, and the God who loves you, and the God who's the same God as he always was, will walk with you through them. Sometimes we can do everything right and still find ourselves in the lion's den. We can do everything right and still find ourselves in the lion's den. Sometimes the faithfulness of God doesn't look like peace every day. But it might look like being put on display so that the character that he's built in you over time shows off his faithfulness to those around you, like the king and the enemies. Sometimes God's faithfulness, the reward for your faithfulness and his faithfulness to you is allowing you as a billboard to walk through cruddy things in life and show off his faithfulness to you in the middle of it. So, but we're tempted sometimes to think that, God is guaranteeing us some perfect, easy walk through life. And he's our vending machine God that's supposed to, make us happy all the time. That's not who he is. Sometimes doing the right thing will put you in a den of lions. And it might look like punishment to everyone around you. Or even in your dark moments, it might look like that to yourself as well. But if we'll remain faithful through it, the other side will look greater. And will create greater glory for God and a greater reward for us. Also in this moment, it was of interest to me. It stuck out to me this time that I had never noticed before. Of the Mexican standoff that they had on the outside of this cave, right? They roll a rock and then they seal it with wax, right? And the king sealed it and the nobles sealed it to make sure that Daniel's situation wouldn't be altered. Does the seal keep Daniel in? No. The seal is not about keeping Daniel in. The seal is about keeping anybody else out from coming and meddling with it. So by this point, the king knows what these guys were up to. He knows that they want Daniel dead. And they know that the king wants Daniel alive because he's been trying all day to circumvent this law unsuccessfully. So they're both sealing it with their rings, both the king and these guys, and everyone's ring is pressed in the rocks and sealed. It's like, you ain't going to save him, king. You're not going to send someone and save him, or we're going to know. And the king's like, well, you're not going to send an assassin to kill Daniel if the lions don't get him either. And here's what we're doing. It's basically entrusting Daniel to God as displayed by the lions. No man's going to meddle with this now. Now we're entrusting this up to God. And the king says, let's hope that your God can save you. Or he says, not even that. He says, your God will save you. That stuck out to me here. Then the king returned to his palace, verse 18, and he spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. The king had a very restless night. It's interesting, it was like a movie. It was like they throw Daniel in the lion's den, and then they cut away. And now we're seeing the king. We're like, I don't want to see the king. I want to know what happened to Daniel. And we're in the story we're brought to, like we all know because we grew up knowing the story, but in this moment, we don't really know what's going on. We're with the king, and the king's pacing around, and he can't sleep, and he's restless. And then at the first light of dawn, the king got up, and he hurried to the lion's den. And when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? He comes and he's asked, Daniel, was your God able? And he's waiting for a second to hear Daniel's voice. And if I was with Daniel, I'd be like, count to 5 before you answer. You know, like on every reality show when there's an answer coming, like you're waiting, what are they going to say? And they drag it out, those pauses. If I was filming the movie, I'd be, just wait. He put you here. Just let him sweat it out another couple seconds. But then finally Daniel answers. Verse 21, Daniel answers, may the king live forever. My God sent his angels, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in your sight, nor have I done anything wrong before you, your majesty. God shut the mouths of the lions. Now it wasn't Daniel in a lion's den. Because of that angel, because of God, these were lions in Daniel's den. Daniel owned that den at this point. Listen, Daniel's life, as you've been reading already, was a marathon of faithfulness. From a young man taken into custody in a foreign land with a deep resolve to honor God. And here, up through his 80s, having built consistent habits of holiness that have sustained his character all of these years. The predictability of his faithfulness to God is what gave his enemies knowledge of how to trap him, and yet it didn't matter that they knew how to trap him, because the same consistent faithfulness led to God judging him as consistently faithful and worth saving. Listen, it was Daniel's faithfulness that got him into the den. It was Daniel's faithfulness to God that got him out of the den. The same faithfulness that got him in the den got him out of the den. Because God judged him as faithful, on display for all to see, sealed, no man could meddle with it. We're going to see what God says about Daniel, and God vindicates him. Also interesting to me here in this account, prior to being thrown in the den, we don't see any record of Daniel arguing on his behalf or defending himself at all. But here, he leaves it entirely up to God. Until finally, after God judges him as faithful, Daniel answers. And he says, God has found me faithful. And by the way, I haven't done anything to you, king, either. I'm just going to throw this out there. It's interesting to me. It says there that Daniel says that an angel came and shut the mouths of the lions. There were lots of lions in there. It wasn't just one or two. Lots. We know that in a couple verses. You're going to see why. Because some other people are going to be thrown in. And it says their bodies couldn't even hit the ground before they were gobbled up. There's a lot of people that get thrown in. So there was a lot of lions. But the angel shuts the mouths of the lions. And it's only named as an angel. Now, not every single angel in the Old Testament is an Old Testament revelation or appearing of Jesus. But I was thinking about it, like, maybe, we often say with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they were thrown into the fire, the king says, there's a fourth man in there, and it looks like the Son of God. Now, probably because he says, as Son of God, we attribute that as Jesus, but a lot of times when we say it's like Jesus was in the fire with him, I'm just throwing it out there. It doesn't say specifically that this was Jesus, but it could have been Jesus. in this den with Daniel here. Just a point of note of interest. Here's verse 23. The king was overjoyed, and he gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And then when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Now, this next text is a bit rough. Remember those nobles who insisted that the king follow the law of the Medes and the Persians? And they came back rubbing the king's nose in it. Remember, it's the law of the Medes and the Persians. You've got to follow it. They overplayed their hand a little bit. Well, that same law of the Medes and the Persians also said, on account of the guilt of one, all of the kin must perish as well. So verse 24 says, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. Ouch. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Listen, the Bible says that one who digs a pit will fall into it. The one who rolls a stone, it will roll back on them. In the end, God judges fairly. Then closing the story, King Darius wrote to the entire nation as a result of this, and peoples of every language in all the earth. And he said, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prophesied during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus, also the reign of Cyrus the Persian. In every chapter that you've been reading in Daniel so far, we see a pattern, and it's played out in chapter 6 as well. The pattern goes like this. The people stand firm in their convictions to God, number one. Number two, God honors and protects them. And number three, the people, even the pagans, honor God and give him glory as a result. Daniel says, God rescued me because I trusted him. And so consequently, Daniel is even listed in the Hall of Heroes in Hebrews chapter 11 as great men of faith. It says there in 11, I think it's 11:3, that by faith he stopped the mouths of the lions. Daniel's obedience and willingness to trust God as his judge meant that one man affected the entire nation and peoples of the known world at that time. Remember, God's faithfulness prevails. And remember, our faithfulness sometimes might leave us ending up in a lion's den. But the glory that God got from this in the end is greater than it had ever been. Because we had a complete turnaround here. We have a guy who's in 1 minute saying, no one prays to anyone but me, I'm your God, to a guy who's saying, the real God is Daniel's God, and everyone needs to revere and worship him. What a change. One man did that by being faithful to his God and being willing to stick to his convictions, even in the face of death, and even when it looked like civil disobedience, and even when it looked like a bad choice. You could reason in your mind why this was a bad choice. But the real hero of the story is not Daniel, it's God. It's God's faithfulness. And you'll notice it's the king at the end of this that doesn't come out praising Daniel. He comes out praising God. The king, the formerly pagan king is now singing, to God be the glory, great things he has done. Right? He's praising God because of what Daniel had done. And lastly, we close with this. The story of Daniel foreshadows an interesting parallel for us of something that's going to happen hundreds of years after Daniel. The story of a man who lived a blameless life, who was falsely accused, like Daniel, in part because of jealousy, who did not defend himself before his accusers, who was sentenced to certain death, and then was placed in a cave with a stone rolled over it that was sealed. and then was delivered from death, with God receiving all the glory. It's a foreshadow of Jesus as well. Here's what we want to pick from this. God is faithful, and our faithfulness to him might lead us into a lion's den sometimes. But if we'll remain faithful when faced with those tough choices, and the strength in which to remain faithful is derived from that consistent walk with God every day, and remembering that we're of his kingdom and not this kingdom that we live in. But if we'll derive that strength from the Lord and remain faithful to him, he will judge us fairly. He will be faithful as well to us in the end, and he will get all the glory.